Space, the final frontier. Outer space has forever enthralled us and captured our gaze. Only in the past half a century have we been able to travel into the unforgiving and harsh realm of space. But what propelled us to such heights in innovation and technology? What were the effects of such exploration and innovation? The mid-20th century space race was a period of rapid exploration and technological development that involved the exchange of ideas and a multitude of encounters with technological failure, as well as a military and political confrontation between the United States and the USSR. Robert Goddard, known as the father of rocketry, was a relatively unknown physicist and professor in Massachusetts when on March 16, 1926, he launched the first liquid-fueled rocket. The liquid-fueled rocket was vital to the space race, as it could function in the vacuum of space and would eventually promote the exchange of ideas between German rocket scientists and their Soviet counterparts. Although his innovation made space travel viable, he wouldn't be recognized for his work until captured German physicists such as Wernher von Braun revealed that their work was entirely based upon Goddard's. Until then, however, he was unrecognized and even berated by his peers until his death. The New York Times wrote on January 13, 1920, that rockets would never be able to function in a vacuum and that Goddard's work was absurd. The Times famously recounted its error following the moon landings.
In 1942, under the direction of Wernher von Braun, the A-4 rocket, or best well known as the V-2 missile, was designed and launched successfully. Used as a so-called vengeance weapon against the Allies by the Nazis, it was fortunately made operational too late and in too few numbers, but achieved the first human milestone in space exploration. It was the first man-made object to breach the atmosphere and enter the void of space.
Early rocket pioneers had theorized that their designs and mathematics behind this rocket would work, but the V-2 was the first time that we had, in large scale, proof that their designs did work.
More ominously, it was also the first ballistic missile to be used in operational combat, and would inspire the future intercontinental ballistic missiles and rockets that would bring the first space probes and satellites to space. Following the liberation of Europe after World War II, the United States and the USSR made a mad scramble for the extremely valuable German rocket scientists. During Operation Paperclip, the US Army secretly transported German scientists and their families to the United States and destroyed equipment and data to avoid it falling into the hands of the Soviets. Wernher von Braun, the designer of the V-2, was one of these scientists, and he would go on to design the Saturn V rocket, which put man on the moon. The information and data exchanged between the US, Soviet, and German scientists would prove crucial to the innovation and exploration of the space race. Although the USSR and the US had been allies during World War II, tensions escalated after the war. In 1949, the Soviets launched their first atomic bomb in response to US nuclear technology, which had been showcased to an extremely destructive effect at the end of World War II. This would spark a nuclear arms race, which would culminate in both countries having the capability to destroy the world several times over.
And thus, on October 4th, 1957, the USSR successfully launched the first man-made satellite into space, using the modified R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile. Named Sputnik 1, or Fellow Traveler, it became the spark that truly began the space race between the United States and the Soviets. This successful orbit shocked the Americans, as it, with its unique history of being a pioneer nation in exploration, would not tolerate the Russians leaping past them in space exploration. Militarily, this launch also worried Americans in that a satellite could be used to spy or launch weapons.
Thus, the space race began. The United States produced and launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, in 1958, under the direction of the same scientists who built the V-2. Werner von Braun, and a new organization, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. In addition to Explorer, NASA launched the Vanguard space probe, which became the first solar-powered space vehicle and remains the oldest one in orbit today. However, the Soviets had already launched 3 Sputnik satellites by this time, one of which carried the first animal in space, a dog named Laika. In 1961, the Soviets again stunned the world by launching the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, a cosmonaut.
At the height of the space race, the Soviets were launching their cosmonauts. The most visible part of space race was sending people into space. And the big prize was sending people to the moon and getting them back safely. And we won that, obviously.
In 1960, a young and dashing President John F. Kennedy was elected. In 1962, he gave his famous moon speech in Rice Stadium, in which he proclaimed the sending of a man to the moon by the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Finally, on May 5, 1961, just 23 days after Gagarin's space expedition, Alan B. Shepard became the first American in space. The Gemini program, meant to send U.S. astronauts to the moon, was started on December 7, 1961. Although the United States had trailed every Soviet accomplishment thus far, the landing of a man on the moon would mark the pinnacle of the space race. On March 18, 1965, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov performed the first successful spacewalk. However, poor planning almost resulted in his death due to an inflated suit. The US was not to be caught napping, however, and Ed White performed the first American spacewalk less than 4 months later. Unlike Leonov's spacewalk, it was properly planned and successful. In January of 1966, the Soviet Union lost Sergei Korolev, one of their most foremost rocket scientists, due to a hemorrhoid operation. From this time on, the Soviet space program began to wane, and innovation began to slow. This was the Soviet Union's most prominent encounter with failure. On the other hand, the US space program continued to grow at an extremely rapid pace. Several more Gemini launches were carried out, most being highly successful. All Gemini space flights as well as Soviet space launches utilized modified intercontinental ballistic missiles, meant to send warheads an extremely long distance. It would not be until Apollo 11 when a specially tailored rocket, the Saturn V, would be used. Unfortunately, the US space program encountered one of their first disasters. On January 27, 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed when their Apollo 1 capsule caught fire, killing all inside. However, this failure didn't prevent new successes by the United States and NASA. The Mariner 4 probe performed the first successful Martian flyby, while the lunar orbiter successfully orbited the moon. This would help scientists prepare for the moon landings. Finally, on July 1969, American astronauts Edwin Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and the now well-known Neil Armstrong departed Earth. 4 days later, Apollo 11 successfully landed on the surface of the moon. It was there that Neil Armstrong took the first step on the moon, and the United States triumphantly placed itself in front of the USSR in space exploration.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Although conflict evidently drove exploration, encounters, and exchange during the space race, conflict did not define the future of space exploration. Today, space exploration continues, but not in the form of conflict, but cooperation. Russian, Chinese, US, and other space agencies, both governmental and private, work together to inspire new innovation and exploration. Cooperation in place of conflict will bring future space exploration and innovation to new heights.